I never anticipated in my life spending this much time on phone calls with lawyers and accountants.
Greetings from the UAE, and all the way from New York is our guest, our super duper special guest. Hey, Nick.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
How cold is it in New York today? You're in a
More than cold enough
t-shirt.
for
It's
me.
like you should be in the desert with us. What are you doing in a
I
t-shirt?
know I'm very sad to be calling in from New York and not back in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, especially at this time.
Nick, tell us a little bit about how you got into the world of fintech. We'll come back to, in the rest of the discussion, our recent uh, fintech tour in the UAE and how we were hanging out together. But let's go back to the sort of start of time. You know, you're working at Funding Circle. How did you get into fintech?
Oh, it goes even before then. But let me first say, thank you so much, Brendan and Gaurav, for having me on the show. This is like talking to the president and the prime minister of fintech across the MENA. I feel like these are the two biggest celebrities whenever I talk to anybody in North Africa and even Pan African fintech. And so I'll definitely watch my words when I'm giving my
So when
life
you talk to them,
story.
they're like, who? Like,
Yes, I'm not going to tell
they're
you
like,
who's the prime
Gara,
minister and
who?
who's the president. Suffice it to say, two big names. So I really appreciate the invite. And the story definitely starts long before Funding Circle. So, uh, in something that I think most people probably don't know about me is my dad is an economist and he works on poverty and inequality. And so you don't really have a choice as a kid but to be interested in the things that your parents are interested in. And one day in school when I was about 15, they rolled this video projector in a class and we watched a video on this community financial organization called the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, where Muhammad Yunus had just won the Nobel Prize for economics for what he had done with communities and microfinance. And I thought, this light bulb went off my head, and I said, you hear so much growing up about social initiatives that are charity based. We're going to give money to this cause and give money to this cause and donate it out of the good of our hearts. But here was somebody who was actually working on building a business that was self reinforcing, that had a profit, and yet could also be used to create lasting social change and sustainable good within communities that are normally neglected by banks and institutions and politicians. And for me, that was kind of a watershed moment, but I didn't realize it at the time. You never really do realize why these moments are important for you at the time. It's only when you look back years and years and years later, and it has been years and years and years and years and years and years and years. So in college, I started working for the Stanford Center for Poverty and Inequality. I worked for the Stanford Center for International Development doing research. I worked for a microfinance institution, two actually, in patient capital. And I was a brand rep for an alternative payment method that was actually founded at the time by Mickey Malka, who is the Ribbit Capital co-founder, called Bling Nation. Although I didn't know who Mickey Malka was, I didn't know what fintech was. I just knew that campus reps were getting compensated for going around and promoting this alternative payment method for mobile. But it kind of clicked into the same trend for me of saying, look, there's different ways that people can be using and managing their money that are built for the 21st century and not the 20th, and that can really take root kind of at the individual level rather than being handed to them top down from banks. And so coming out of college, I got connected to the Funding Circle co-founders when they were just starting up the company. And at the time, it was called Endurance Lending Network. It was nothing more than a pitch deck that looked like it had been put together in a private equity boiler room. And I said, you know what? I don't want to be a consultant.
I'm all in.
Why not? Why not take a bet? And that's how I got started.
And then What was that experience like being at Funding Circle? Talk about how you got involved in your subsequent roles at Petal and Google Pay, and how that's kind of shaped your thinking as a professional on fintech. I mean, we've got a nice sneak peek into the kind of the philosophical or family heritage there, and how you got interested in sort of topics of justice and access. How did that sort of professional journey work out?
When you're talking about your experiences and your resume and your prior roles, it's a little bit like looking at, this is going to be a bad analogy, but bear with me, like a Jackson Pollock painting in a museum, where you see this square canvas with defined lines and this beautiful splatter chart on top of it, or series of ink splats. And what you don't think about is, what does the studio look like right now? What does the artist studio look like? There's probably paint all over the walls, all over the materials, on the floor, everywhere. Everything but where the canvas was is probably a mess. And so when I think about kind of what my resume looks like, as head of business development at Google Pay, VP of strategy at Petal, director of partnerships at Funding Circle, it looks like that very neat painting that sits in the gallery, but the reality is more like the studio back at home that nobody sees, where there's paint all over the place and it's a mess, and discarded food wrappers from late night work sessions. So at Funding Circle, for the first couple of years, there wasn't really a company. We were a team of one and then a team of nine, and it was very small, and everybody did every job, and it was very exciting. And every week we ran into a new existential crisis that we felt could shut the company down. And every week somehow we surmounted it and pivoted and figured out a way to get past it. And there were moments of extreme frustration. There were moments of disagreement, but there were also a lot of team wins that brought us together. And I, formed some of my still longest lasting partnerships, trying to make things work out. And so, I worked kind of 20 different jobs at the same time because there was nobody else to do them. So did everybody else in the team. And unlike, going into banking or consulting or working for a large, practice or services organization, there isn't kind of a fixed mentorship ladder where you learn a skill set, you hone the craft, and then you go and apply it, and you have people there to learn from. It's really all hands on deck. The co-founders are just bailing water, trying to keep the company alive at all times. You have 10 priorities, and you can only really address the top 3. So you better be good at identifying what the top 3 are. And so it was a great experience for me because I had to learn a lot very quickly on my own and then apply it in real time, just like everybody else in the company. So a lot of trial by fire. But eventually we hit momentum and we got things building up, and we merged with Funding Circle in the UK, and things grew from there. So I could eventually put that neat little capstone on that said Director of Strategic Partnerships. But the road to there was very, very curvy.
What did that experience you went through at Funding Circle, from like day 0 before joining to leaving, what were the things you look back and go, wow, I just had no idea that's how it got, I knew what the meal looked like when it came out of the kitchen, but in the kitchen, that's how it's made. Like, what were the 2 or 3 things that you would like look back to another time goes, whoa, if I hadn't been in that startup kitchen, I would have no idea it worked like that.
That's a much more adept analogy, I think. Jackson Pollock is a very, very generous way to characterize our final work.
Gaurav has seen how bad I'm in the kitchen, so last time he was in my house, he had to take over because
I can confirm.
Yeah.
It's all right. We have a tortured artist and a tortured chef on the call. I won't speak for Gaurav, but I think there are many tortured chefs on this call right now. Although maybe my girlfriend's a little bit more tortured by my attempts at a chef than I am.
I'm sure it's better than my microwave. So, that's my whole cuisine. Open the microwave.
Not a very high standard, brother. There's not a very high standard.
Which is good if you're happy. I mean, well, there's a lesson there for startups too. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Sometimes you just need to shift things. and you need to ship things that are imperfect frequently. And if they're good enough, you can get them out. And this kind of second lesson there is often just staying alive is the most important determinant of success. People who kind of fixate on having a perfect product, well, that's a luxury later on when you have the resources to do it. But in the early days, if you can just avoid getting shut down, you can outlast competitors, you can make it to the next fundraise, you can figure out what sticks to acquire new customers and internalize those lessons and scale. And so our co-founder used to say, everything here is stuck together with bubblegum and duct tape. And I think that is very true and very normal for a startup where the only thing that operates right is the landing page. And even that is not a given. But everything that happens behind the scenes is the pretty form that you're putting your information into is outputting to like an FTP export CSV, and somebody's downloading that CSV and they're manually copying over the information and making AI decisions that are actually some college intern who's sitting at the table next to you. As long as you're doing it in a compliant way, because let's remember this is fintech, that's totally fine. The importance is that the customer feels like the experience that they're getting is better than the experience they could get from the existing competitors, and they're wild about it. It doesn't matter what's happening behind the scenes. You'll figure it out. You'll scale. Just make the customer feel like they're really getting a premier experience.
So staying alive is a big thing that you learned from your first startup experience. Just staying alive, getting something done rather than aiming for the perfect, and just shipping, getting it out the door while delivering a better client experience at the end of it all. Then you switched to Google Pay, and I don't know how big Google was already, but I'm guessing it's already quite a behemoth when you start working for it, or it's a pretty big company, and maybe not as big as it is today, but still, it's a big company. What was that like going from, I know there was a kind of in-between stage of Petal, but I'm just jumping from the start to like, not the end, but where you've been most recently. Compare and contrast experience of being in a payment role or a fintech role in Google for those early startup days.
I don't want to brag, but when I joined Google, when I joined Google, there were 100,000 employees, and when I left Google, there were 102,000 employees. Which is to say, there were not a lot of significant changes between the start and the end of my 2-year role at Google. The ship had already been built, it was already sailing, and fortunately over my tenure, we did not sink it. But I found it really interesting to move from an organization where what you don't do is much more important than what you do. As a startup, you have to be very, very, very focused with your resources. There are many opportunities around you, but you have to understand which ones develop on top of the core competencies that you've already built, and allow you to leverage what you have to the maximum impact, and leave everything else kind of behind. And we do this week in FinTech too. We have this document called Ideation that everybody puts great ideas for this week in FinTech on. And there's so many amazing ideas that I want to pursue. And we do maybe like 2 of them. And that's, just how startups operate. At Google, it's the opposite problem. What you do is much more important than what you don't do. And we have this like massive conglomerate with many, many different arms that somehow all have to roll up into one comprehensive story and common strategy. And Google developed this entire system of OKRs, objectives and key receivables, just to make that possible. And so it was interesting joining an organization where you have this very methodical, repeatable, well-run strategy with a system, and saying, okay, what does product execution look like here? And finding out that in many ways, it's just like a startup. Like, we have more resources, but there are many, swags, scientific wild ass guesses about what you should do and what you should launch and how you should do it and what the design should be like. We'll use user research to inform behavior, but sometimes UXR is inconclusive, or you'll have multiple users you interview who say completely opposite things. You'll have, systems in the background like payments order processing that, are operating just like those systems that I talked about with the CSV export at the startup. And so the thing is, like, you always have to build a plane to some extent while you're flying. Of course, it's amazing to do it at $1 trillion market cap company with a ton of resources. And you get a little bit spoiled, honestly, working with all those resources. But I was surprised how much at Google people were still kind of learning as they went. I thought it would be night and day, and there were a lot of similarities.
Interesting. And then you began doing this newsletter that's become quite a big thing. Talk about that. How did that start, the This Week in FinTech?
Well, they say those who can do, build, and those who can't, write. And so
I thought they write on VC. I don't know.
No, it feels a lot like a startup these days. I'm very lucky that we have a team of 20 now at This Week in FinTech, and people are excited about our mission and all collaborating to make this a whole. And it's good that it frees me up a lot of the time to really focus on the fun side of things. The newsletter started as just an internal email to people on my team at Pedal. We had just constant Slack chatter about this FinTech launch, this thing, this FinTech's doing this. And people were constantly, I want to say questioning, but wondering about whether we should do something to emulate what another FinTech was doing, or whether we should be repositioning ourselves in the market. And the thing is, at a startup, you should pretty much just peek your head up like once every 3 or 6 months to see what the market's doing. But other than that, be a laser focused on executing against your plan. A lot of news events are just distractions at the end of the day. And just because a company launches something doesn't mean it's going to work. And so I put the newsletter together to say, look, here's what's going on a week-to-week basis. This is everything that everybody needs to know. Digest this, internalize it. Where there are lessons from it, let's draw them and apply them to products we're launching. But we don't need to spend all of our time kind of consistently worried about what's going on outside of these four walls. Like, let's focus on what's going on inside these four walls and build together. So it started out as a team newsletter. A few friends of mine on the team forwarded it to other people. They forwarded it to other people. People started reaching out to me directly and asking to subscribe. And I said, subscribe, this is just an email that I write. But the light bulb went off and I said, there's probably a bigger demand here. And so when I left, I rolled it out into its own standalone newsletter. And, I still remember getting my 100th subscriber. It was an amazing feeling. And I said, okay, finally, it's not just my mom who's, signed up for this. We have 55,000 subscribers today. We passed our 50th in December. Yes, and this is not just me. It's due to the amazing writing staff that we have, our great editors, our podcasters, the events team that's bringing together the community. We've got a Slack group with 5,000 FinTech people in it. We have this event series, and we were able to pull off our first ever international FinTech trek in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Thanks in very, very large part, Ronan and Gaurav, to both of you and all the help that you provided us. So it feels like day one, maybe not day zero, but day one here. It's very early. Who knows where this is going to go, but it's been an exciting journey to watch.
And if you look back over all the months, and if you had to almost color code it and say, this color is for this theme, like, I don't know, making it up now, like neobanks or open banking or crypto or blockchain. How does that collide, just carrying on the Jackson Pollock theme? How does that color pattern look? As in, was it lots of neobank splotches a couple of years ago, or is it more now? Or I'm trying to find an artistic way of asking the question of like, what the F are you writing about?
Oh man, I hope there's some modern art student who's sitting on this interview and watching us later, just cringing at all of our references.
Oh, absolutely, because the idea of three bankers or FinTech people talking about art is just like, and we're making references to like what 50, 60-year-old art now. I mean,
yeah, exactly. And that's the most current
Jackson
reference
Pollock hasn't shocked anyone since the 1960s or 50s, right? 50s, right? When was Jackson Pollock? Quick, Google it, Gaurav.
FinTech podcast incites art riots.
No, it's okay. I think all the artists of the world are too busy raging at the NFT space to really pay much attention.
No, well, you know, the joke is when you get this, I think it's a 19th century joke. I can't remember where it's from. You put three bankers in a room, they talk about art. You put three artists in a room, they talk about money.
Yes. I hadn't heard that before, but it's so true.
Yeah, it's like, I think it's a really old saying. Yeah. But anyway, back to the kaleidoscope that is this week in FinTech.
No, FinTech moves in waves, definitely. And sometimes it's something that I get a little frustrated by on the investing side. To be honest, is that there's so much banter within the tech community about being contrarian and having unique, differentiated perspectives and being the lone voice in the wilderness that sees the future. And yet, there's a lot of herd mentality, and I'm sure that both of you have seen the same thing, where different business models come in vogue and then fall out of vogue. And it's very helpful to see a couple of those cycles to be able to kind of recognize the same dynamics. And so in FinTech, there were monoline service providers like direct-to-consumer lenders, direct-to-business lenders, and then a lot of savings providers, investment providers. Then a lot of these services started getting wrapped up, and you had the rise of the neobanks in kind of the mid-10s, 2015 era, where Monzo, N26, Revolut, Chime, Vero, all developed these kind of comprehensive banking suites, but they were digital and mobile first. And then you had, in the US, like high APY wars for high savings accounts that were completely dependent on the Fed rate staying high and not kind of like a sustainable long-term product innovation. And then that gave way to, crypto and then decentralized finance a couple of years ago, which grew, but, business models weren't sustainable. They were just being built on different rails. And within that, you have like sub-trends, like creator economy tooling that was very popular for a while. Payroll APIs are very popular for a while. And so what I look for is what are areas that nobody is talking about yet? Because by the time it's part of the conversation, it's probably too late. And most of these areas, the difficulty is like most of these areas that you look at that nobody's talking about will never be anything. And you'll look crazy for investing in them. You'll invest in 9 companies in areas that are very unloved, and they're unloved for good structural reasons that are very hard to appreciate at the time. And those 9 companies won't work out. But the 10th company you look at that's unloved in an unloved area will tap into this deep resentment of the existing customer set with the current solutions that they have on hand, and this deep willingness to pay just to get away from those solutions. And it will build on that to develop a lot of affinity and scale and replicate itself in other markets, and then it'll transform everything. That's really what I look for. But there's this quote by Andres Guide that you can't discover new lands without consenting to lose sight for a very long time of the shore. And I think about that a lot because you have to look crazy for a long time before you look like a genius.
I want to switch to talking about the fund you launched out of the newsletter and then the recent trip to the Middle East. And I want to bring in my partner in crime, Gaurav, to grill you on that because he claims investing is like his superpower. Go on, Gaurav.
I've never claimed that investing is my superpower.
Well, you've invested what, 50,000 FinTechs or 500,000? I don't know. We were joking about this at lunch with Namir today, Stu.
Yeah,
I think I can say second generation FinTech entrepreneur, over 100 founder, over 100 FinTech investments.
Way more.
A few more, but yeah.
That's just on Mondays.
Oh, come on. Give me a break. Both of you ganging up on me. That's not fair. My turn to grill you.
Like number of the rows in the Excel spreadsheet? We ran out, apparently.
I'll deal with you later, mister. But But yeah, it is an interesting question because we've known each other for a while now through a common friend that introduced us. I remember when we first started our chat, and that time you were still at Google, but you were doing some part of investing. You had your newsletter; it was still growing, had a lot of people, and even your newsletter audience is actually a lot of funds. This is not just angel investors or people that have interest in the topics at hand. You have some of the biggest VCs in the United States and some other parts of the world actually subscribe and listen or watch what your newsletter has to say. So I know that you had started doing angel investing in your own capacity because, I mean, obviously in your neck of the woods, you saw opportunity to do it. But it's interesting, you launched the FinTech fund, right? And while I know you've done it, I never really got to ask you why. Danger of seeing obvious. The thing is, sitting with your experience in what is the largest return market in the world for financial technology companies, you could have gone and started a fintech. You could have gone and rounded up the best of the best. And, as you said, like Houdini, everyone's looking left. You could have gone and built a company that was building something on the right. And 3 years later, people would have looked at you as a different kind of genius, but from a company builder. So you didn't do that. You did fund. First question is why?
It's a good question, and you're right. Nobody has ever asked me that, and I do want to call out here because most people probably don't know. Gaurav has been a longtime supporter of everything that I'm working on. The newsletter, the fund, big promoter of my work, and an LP in the fund, obviously, but that just scratches the surface. And so I am deeply grateful for all of your support, and I still feel, like I said, that for both of us, it's early days, and the limit is really unbounded. The second thing I'll say is, I'm not going to preclude myself from maybe one day being a founder. I've got a very, very deep and long road ahead of me with the fund, but I really enjoy working on products, and I'd one day love to get back to that. Probably not for the next decade, but one day. And being a founder is really a completely different skill set. There's some company building that goes on with building the fund and the newsletter business, and we have 20 people on the team now, but it's not the same as Gaurav, you can attest to this as a founder, putting a product out in the world and having to learn quickly about how that product's doing and iterate on it all the time, forever. So for me, the reason why I started the fund, the reason why I quit this, this job at Google that treated me very well. I mean, part of it was definitely, ego and hubris and wanting to build something from the ground up and saying, I have this passion and energy right now that I might not have forever. Like, let's go out and actually do something that's, world changing. But it was the identification of an opportunity that I felt was too good to avoid. And Gaurav gave really helpful background. I'd been investing in fintech on my own account and then putting together SPVs from 2019. And we as a group were getting into really competitive rounds with these brand name startups that were making a splash and getting a lot of buzz, and they were category defining. And brand name venture firms were getting shut out from the rounds. And yet here we are, writing a 50K or 100K check and getting in. And so to me, I said, look, this is obviously a desirable asset class to get access to. There is some differentiated deal flow here that's coming to us because of This Week in FinTech. And there are probably a lot of investors out there who look for these kinds of companies to get into them, but just don't have any access and would otherwise just want to find some entry point to be able to get allocation within these fast growth companies. And so, I kind of looked at my range of options of what I could do and said, this is the most high impact way that I can be spending my time right now. Is we're on one side growing, what we want to be the largest and most engaged and most well-networked fintech community in the world. And on the other hand, we have this very special ability to tap into the best fintech founders because of that community. And there should be some way for us to be a conduit and direct capital that wants to find them to the founders that they want to invest in. There are very, very many emerging managers relative to 3 years ago. In 2021, there was a new fund raised every 8 hours in the US.
Wow.
Internationally, I'm sure that picture is much bigger. And many of those emerging managers target areas that have been very buzzy in the past couple of years: crypto, Web3, DeFi, blockchain, fintech, probably AI now. And this is a little bit of the herd mentality that I was talking about, that like I think can kind of be a negative factor in venture investing. But for me, it's how do I set myself apart from this like very large cohort of other emerging managers? And it really comes back to the fact that we have this amazing community, Ronan and Gaurav, with yourselves being a big part of it, and building your own adjacent community across MENA FinTech and through the MENA FinTech Association. But that ends up being a difference maker.
Right. It's super interesting. You have the newsletter, you have your own experience, you're getting access to deals, you're investing your own money, and a few people who are coming along with you on these SPVs and ticket sizes. To going from an angel investor to a full-blown fund manager, fiduciary duty, structured collection, structured deployment, and then on top of that, obviously getting permanent LPs to come in and contribute to the fund and be part of that journey. It is night and day, and it is a lot of different effort, right? And there are a great deal of many fintech funds out there of different levels for people to put capital into. How was that something where you found yourself easily differentiating from someone? Because the first thing investors look for when they're putting committed capital down into a fund is, what is your track record of returns, or what is your track record of your team? And that's a fundamental, that's very tough. Yes, you have the background, but no investors still ask that question. How did you put yourself to differentiate yourself and create that confidence? And how quickly did you find that people came through or didn't come through? Was it a different messaging? Was it very simple? Was it you were always subscribed overnight, that you had more money than you could handle? What actually happened on that journey? Tell us about, what was the process? Was it difficult? Was it easy? And what were the key points in that allowed you to get to closing the fund and moving forward? Because we know that part of the story. Spoiler alert, but we don't know the journey that you took. So share that with us, because it's not easy. So many funds.
I never anticipated in my life spending this much time on phone calls with lawyers and accountants and auditors. I think I've spoken to enough to give me my life saturation of lawyer calls. But it's a good question, and I am I kind of early on in the days of Funding Circle, where it was so important to get things right and get things right quickly in the first time, and adjust if you get things wrong, had this maniacal attention to detail beaten into me. And so I'm actually much, much, much more paranoid about handling somebody else's money than my own. If I misallocate my own money, then only I get mad at me. But in the emerging manager set, there's so much time spent on how fun it is and how cool early stage startups are, and how fun to all be venture capitalists now, and disruption and shiny lights. We forget this is an incredible privilege. It's one that you definitely have to earn, like you said, by virtue of having a track record. People are taking a big gamble on you. You don't have, no matter what, if it's your first fund, you don't have that much of a track record to go off of that can give people a good sense of what their likely dispersion of outcomes is going to be. And it is a privilege that can be immediately taken away. And so I am, maniacal and obsessive and paranoid about exactly how we're doing things at the fund, making sure that we're very buttoned up on everything that we do, and making sure that we're being thoughtful about how we allocate that money. because I realized that even though it's not my money, it's my brand on the line. It's my, future on the line. It's my personal credibility on the line. And all of these things are much more important currency within tech than money at the end of the day. Money is fungible. Money comes and goes. You can have 3 bad ideas and raise funds for the 4th one and create a category defining, unicorn. But if you do things to torch your credibility, then that will not happen. And so, there have been a lot of steep learning curves building a legal institution, a series of legal institutions, and getting them off the ground to give this fund a good base. But I'm very fortunate that a lot of investors and LPs who I respect very much have taken the journey with me and taken a gamble on me, and that I now get the opportunity to really prove myself to them and show the world that there is something different here and that we can really make something that's meaningful. And the last thing I'll say is, I put out this tweet that said, founders are basically affirmation camels. You have to go through the desert for a long time without any signals that you're doing something right. And then when you finally get to one tiny piece of affirmation, you drink deeply, deeply, deeply from it. And that one tiny piece of affirmation keeps you going for the next however many days or weeks that you're just going through the desert. And I think that there's some similarities here where early stage investing, you're not going to know if you're a good or bad investor for 7 years. You'll have signs that you can point to, like co-investors, like markups, MOIC, the company's press mentions, that kind of stuff. But really, at the end of the day, nothing matters other than DPI. You need to know how much money is actually coming out of the fund. It doesn't matter if everything gets marked up 10x, 20x, 100x. If it doesn't get to an exit, then you're not a good investor. And so for me, it's really important to start seeing these early signals come through where our portfolio companies this quarter are going on to raise at markups in this market, where a lot of portfolios are headed in the opposite direction. We actually are on track to positive, knock on wood, positive IRR. But you don't get there without being very maniacally obsessed about the details and getting them right early on. And so it's going to be a long journey, but with the right partners like yourself, Gaurav, I think we can get there.
And just one last question before I hand back to Ronan, is there's a selection process, right? Your fund has limited amounts of capital. The traditional way you look at deploying that capital is you invest in X number of companies for this first tranche of your fund, the life cycle. And in phase 2 of your fund, you're essentially investing in the follow-on of the best return possibility for the exits for the fund and your LPs. But looking at the number of companies out there and the selection out there, and so much noise, and so much competition, and so much money chasing so few quality deals, how do you cater to a selection process today? That perhaps someone who's listening to us today can take some tips or learn some lessons from you on some fundamentals that aren't obvious in the fintech space for them to look at, especially today. You have crypto, you have DeFi, you have blockchain, you have infra, you have B2B, you have B2B2C. I can throw out all the terminology and we'll be here for another 3 episodes. But essentially, what can you share from your learnings that some people can benefit on this session today that would guide them to, say, a closer narrative to picking better bets, as we put it, on investing in companies that are fintech?
It's a good question, and my perspectives continue to evolve over time, and my learnings, will continue. And so I'm sure that if you were to ask me this question a year from now or 5 years from now, you'd probably get a different answer. But for me, the fundamentals come back to having a good first principles idea of what's important and what that means for where the world is going. And it's kind of it's easy to say that because it's very abstract. But if I were listening to this interview as a new manager and getting my fund off the ground, the exercise I would go through is what are the times that I've believed something that was very out of consensus, and it turned out at the end of the day that I was right, and most people were wrong. And I didn't speak up or I didn't act on it, but I actually ended up thinking something that ended up being true, and it was not something that was obvious. Evaluate that and understand kind of what it says about your logic. Why were you right when everybody else is wrong? What did you understand that other people didn't? And then find those patterns in the places that you're looking to invest. Like really come back to the first principles that you have for what's going to happen and why, because it will allow you to understand more deeply the undercurrents that are carrying along tech without worrying about what's on the surface of those currents. And so, here's one example of that. We invest in decentralized finance companies. It's a pretty small part of our portfolio. It's like somewhere like more than 5, but sub 10%. And the rule that I've always had for DeFi companies is there has to be a real world use case today. It can't be like this speculative, TVL driven, non-collateralized lending type business where it's just growing, hugely because of crypto fanatics, but there's no actual kind of, it's a closed loop and there's no real world applications. It means that I invested in the least exciting DeFi businesses of the past 2 years. And those least exciting businesses are the only ones that are still alive today. Everything else blew up because there's this closed loop system where, like, if you had asked yourself, fundamentally, you look at like Olympus DAO, it's a naked Ponzi scheme, but it's just dressed up in Web3 terminology. And so if you'd gone back to your first principles and said, okay, why is this growing? What's the potential? What's the long-term impact? Will it continue to go in this direction? If you would really ask those questions, you would have said no. But it's very, very hard to ignore what's going on the surface, which is this thing is growing overnight by crazy multiples. And if you get in now, maybe you can capture some of those multiples. And when you get away from your kind of a priori first principles reasoning, I think that's when you end up making pretty costly mistakes. And so there's, patience matters a lot. Just sit it out and have kind of good innate reasoning that you can constantly check yourself on. So that means I end up being like very allergic to hype as an investor, which hopefully is something that's going to serve me well. But in the meantime, I'm sure that there will be a lot of misses too, where something goes like this and people say, why didn't you get in there? And so, an institution I was talking with yesterday said, you need to develop an anti-portfolio, which is something I need to work on as well. Let's understand where we miss. And when we do miss, come back and ask why. Do we miss for the right reason? Do we miss for the wrong reasons?
So I guess the lesson learned here is essentially one, you can't win them all. That's for sure. And two, be careful of the hype and follow different stories and trends and really validate what you're looking at consistently. I really appreciate you sharing that, Nik, and your own journey on that. And on that note, I'm going to hand back to Ronit.
Just to wrap it all up with something that's quite topical, let's spend a few minutes on that Middle East trip you did, Nik. Why? I mean, it was great. You came to see us and we got some time to hang out, particularly Gaurav and you, but why Dubai? Why Abu Dhabi? I mean, yeah, the World Cup was happening down the road, but was that it? I mean, why not, I don't know, Cape Town or Lagos, if you're interested in Africa, or go to India or somewhere else? Why Dubai and Abu Dhabi?
There are many, many, many answers to that question, and I'm already long-winded enough without needing to unpack them, but I'll try and pick the most relevant ones. One of the weird things about the U.S. is that when you grow up in the U.S., you have the luxury of, if you want, as an individual person, kind of being able to ignore the rest of the world. The U.S. is this like massive self-contained system. And in most other countries, not all, but most, the rest of the world is very directly relevant to what's happening, like it or not. You're very interconnected, you're very interdependent, and international news and events and trade is much more important to your own livelihood. And so the output of that is that I think that there's even for the most international Americans, an easy path where you only think about what's going on in the US and you don't think that much interesting or important development is happening outside of the US in some markets that you're familiar with, China, Western Europe, whatever it is. The reality is that people who are only focused on the US market, which just happens to be where Silicon Valley is based and where the seat of international venture capital is from, miss a lot of really important and interesting and eventually world-changing innovation that's happening outside of those lines. And as you mentioned, Ronit, there are now hubs internationally to us Americans, like Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Lagos, Bangalore, Singapore, and Dubai and Abu Dhabi that are standing up really impressive pools of fintech talent with these very crowded markets of early stage fintech companies that are creating innovative products with no reference back to what's happening in the US. It's a different context. There are different needs, there are different problems to be solved, and you don't need to make a reference back to what Robinhood did or what a firm did or what the Silicon Valley company did. And it's very easy to kind of have your blinders on and say, let's look at what worked in the US and then find it elsewhere, without needing to understand kind of the relevant context. So that's one thing. There's so much interesting innovation happening outside of the US, and I think that we will miss in fintech the most important defining moments of the next decade if we only look in the US. I think that there are so many more fast growth markets outside of there, and Abu Dhabi and Dubai kind of rank at the top of them. The second reason is, we say the MENA or the Middle East and North Africa, but what we're doing when we do that is we group in a bunch of countries that all have different populations with different problems to be solved, with different levels of financial penetration, with different levels of mobile and internet penetration, with different levels of wealth, with different central banks and different financial regimes. And so you have really one of the only commonalities is language. And even that, you can come from Morocco and not understand what somebody from Iraq is telling you. And so you have this huge diversity of markets and needs and potential outcomes where, the way fintech might be dispersed, in the Emirates is radically different from the way they might be dispersed in, Egypt, 100 million, person market with about 30 million of that concentrated in Cairo. And so the question is, how do you bring all of these markets together? And I think that Abu Dhabi and Dubai is the best seated ecosystem. And I had this kind of assumption, but the trip really confirmed it for me, that talent density in those two markets and the cognizance of the fact that we need to build for international scale across the Middle East will probably make that the hub for fintech in the Middle East for a decade, a century, for the foreseeable future. I think Dubai really operates as this gateway between the rest of the world and the Middle East, where if you are a talented person from London or Moscow or New York, you can go to Dubai to start your entrepreneurial journey, and it'll give you the access and exposure you need to access the rest of the market. But the last thing I'll say is we are definitely not there yet. And this was a big learning for me on the trek, is from the great panels, including yours, that we had. There's a hodgepodge of regulatory regimes and appetites. There's not kind of one digital passport you can use to move a fintech from one sandbox to another. And so a lot more coordination is needed and will probably happen. And the great thing is, if you look at what's going on with NEOM in Saudi, if you look at the fintech arm of the Egyptian Central Bank, if you look at VARA, the Virtual Asset Regulatory Authority in the Emirates, the appetite from regulators across the Middle East is now to find ways that they can help usher in transformative innovation. And I think that you will have much more connections made across these countries in the next decade, but it's very, very early and we're not there yet. And there's a lot of work to be done. And the last thing I'll say, again, that I didn't appreciate before I came there, but I did coming out, is when you talk about fintech in the US or Europe, you talk about regulators and government, you normally talk about this adversarial relationship where you're effectively working against regulation, and you're understanding like what you can do that's like within the bounds of regulation, kind of circumventing the intent, and say, how do we give digital services to people in a way that doesn't kind of incur all this regulatory burden that banks have. In Dubai, it's the opposite. In Dubai, a lot of the innovation is being stimulated by the fact that there are all these programs and funds made available top down from the government, because you have forward-looking and proactive people within those governments, and I would say this, the same, to some extent in Riyadh, where there's this cognizance that if you're building like the international hubs for the Middle East, you need to do everything that you can do to promote and create this vibrant ecosystem of technology where you're not building local tech. You're not even just a place for international tech companies like Checkout and Stripe to come create their local hubs. You're building tech and then you're exporting it to the rest of the world. But it takes a lot of work to get that from the ground up. And so rather than having an adversarial relationships, I think regulators and government, what I noticed, are very involved in being promotional of tech. And that was pretty inspiring and different.
That last bit's definitely true. And Gaurav and I live that daily, that the authorities here, of course, while having a regulatory function, are also looking to build and enable and grow. And they've almost got a startup mentality themselves, because these ecosystems and countries, particularly, the financial free zones here in the UAE are, they're relatively young. So the culture is very different from the US, for example, in a professional sense. Can I just pick up on one final point before we wrap up? Because you mentioned talent, and I just play devil's advocate here, and I'll see if anyone kills me tomorrow for saying this, or whenever the show goes out. But
yeah, we're not live.
We're not live. This can be edited out, right, Gaurav? So
talent.
Don't worry, you can be canceled anytime.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the only reason Gaurav and I are considered talented is it's a shallow talent pool here, isn't it? I mean, the talent density you have in New York, where you're sitting, or in the Valley, there's no comparison. Or the number of engineers that China and India put out, I mean, those are mind-blowing. What did you mean by talent density? Isn't it? I mean, a European friend of mine the other day said, Dubai, and I'm almost quoting word for word, it's just fake it, right? It's just marketing, it's a sham. And you've heard this over and over again. So this is nothing that anyone who knows the region won't have heard, particularly from critics outside. There is this consistent theme, and there are enough. And Gaurav and I know this, some of them are our friends, some of them are not our friends, but there are enough posers here as well. What did you mean by talent? Are you just being nice to us? What did you mean by talent density? You're just being nice, right? I mean, let's face it, it's a pond. It's not a deep ocean of talent. What are you talking about?
It's
we can edit all this out, Gaurav, right?
We can if we choose, but I don't mind exposing myself.
No, look, I mean, we'd have these great panels on the promise of fintech in the MENA, and then I'd meet with friends of mine who live in Dubai, and I've lived in Dubai for a decade or more, and behind closed doors, people would say the same thing. Like the show is great, but what's going on behind the show? A lot of times you have these, like you said, posers and hustlers, and people who somehow are like everywhere in the ecosystem and show up at all the events, but don't have a lot of substance behind them. And market themselves as entrepreneurs, and what's going on LinkedIn and what's actually happening are two different things.
Never.
Yeah.
LinkedIn's real life, right?
Oh my God. I'm going to start crying. I'm going to start tears are going to, oh my
CEO
God.
of this, founder of this, general partner of this. And when you look at it, it's like a website. I've run across these people too, and it's something that it's funny because Silicon Valley, you say fake it till you make it, but there's some people in Dubai who've really internalized that. But when I say talent density, though, like in all honesty, if you are an investment manager or a fintech founder, and you want to build something across the Middle East and North Africa, and you just say, okay, let's do this exercise where I sit down and I think about where I could possibly be based. You know, am I going to Tunis? Am I going to Cairo? Am I going to Tel Aviv? You know, am I going to Riyadh? You know, Tel Aviv is comparable. They have a lot of engineering talent density specifically, but there aren't any better cities, I think, that you could launch a fintech company or a pan-Middle East investment entity than Dubai. And there are many, many reasons for that, like government promotion is one that we talked about. But relative to the rest of the region, Dubai just sucks up talent. And so when you think about it in comparison to like a San Francisco or a New York, you know, you're talking about like different markets at different ages. And so I don't think it's necessarily the right comparison to draw. I think the question is, if you were looking to just build something transformative, $1 billion plus outcome across the Middle East, where would you build, you know, Souk? Where would you build Kareem? It's got to be Dubai every time. And I think, you know, these kind of outcomes are self-fulfilling in that one, when you have, you know, Kareem get acquired, a lot of people will leave to start their own tech companies, and that'll bring more talent in. And then when you have an outcome where an acquisition exit is very positive, it's a good signal to others that this is where we want to go in the market. So it's early, but I think what you'll see is like this maturation of really high quality talent in Dubai over the next, you know, call it a decade. And so hopefully we're sitting here in 10 years with a few more gray hairs, you know, with our mansions in the background and talking about, not you though, and talking about, you know, how much has changed in the last decade where you really have Dubai competing head on with San Francisco and New York for international talent.
We look forward to having you back in the region, Nik. Whenever you want to come back and do a temperature check on how that 10-year journey is going, let us know and we'll host you. It's been a real pleasure to have you on our show today.
We'll be checking the temperature in New York and then moving to Dubai for the entire winter.
Come on over.
Come on down.
Habibi, come to Dubai.
There's a space. Yeah, Habibi, come to Dubai. There's a space for you. Thank you so much, Nik, for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me on.
Been a pleasure.